The smell of copper and burning sand never really washes out of your skin. Even here, in the cold, rain-slicked streets of Seattle, Janet Walker could close her eyes and still feel the suffocating heat of the Afghan sun beating down on her tactical vest. She could still hear the rhythmic thwack 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 of the Black Hawk blades chopping through the thin desert air. But when she opened her eyes, there was only the soft, rhythmic breathing of a 7-year-old girl. Nora. Janet stood in the doorway of the tiny, cramped bedroom, watching her daughter sleep. The street lights from the alleyway painted faint orange stripes across Nora's face. She was clutching a worn-out stuffed bear, a cheap prize Janet had won for her at a local carnival before the inflation hit. Before the rent doubled, and before the silence of civilian life became more deafening than a war zone. Janet leaned against the doorframe, instinctively rubbing the faint, jagged scar that ran along her collarbone, a parting gift from a sniper in Helmand Province. She had served 3 tours as an Army Ranger medic, pulling broken men out of shattered Humvees while bullets snapped through the air like angry hornets. She had survived explosions, ambushes, and the kind of bleeding chaos that broke stronger people. But nothing terrifies a combat veteran quite like a past-due electric bill. She walked over to the small kitchen table, the linoleum peeling at the edges. A stack of envelopes sat there, glowing ominously in the dim light. Final notice. Disconnection warning. Her meager disability check barely covered the groceries. And her night shifts as a security guard at a downtown warehouse were a joke. She was a highly trained apex predator. A woman who knew 30 different ways to neutralize a threat before they could draw a weapon. And society had handed her a flashlight and a minimum wage badge. Janet picked up her phone. The screen was cracked, but the text message glowing on it was crystal clear. It was from Marcus, her old commanding officer who now ran an elite, shadowy private security firm. Got a whale of a contract. High risk, high reward. The kind of money that makes your problems disappear. Walker, you in? She looked back toward the bedroom. Nora shifted in her sleep, coughing softly. The apartment was too cold. The neighborhood was too dangerous. Janet didn't survive the worst places on earth just to let her daughter drown in poverty. She typed her reply, her thumbs flying across the shattered glass. Where and when? The phone buzzed almost instantly. The Sterling Tower, 8 a.m. Dress like you're ready for a funeral. Janet set the phone face down. She didn't know it yet. But the war she thought she had left behind in the desert was nothing compared to the bloodbath waiting for her in the penthouses of the American elite. The Sterling Tower pierced the gray Seattle skyline like a massive, glass dagger. It was a monument to wealth, power, and unchecked arrogance. Victor Sterling wasn't just a billionaire, he was an emperor in a tailored suit. He owned shipping lanes, tech conglomerates, and a fleet of politicians. But Victor Sterling was also a ruthless, cold-blooded tyrant, and tyrants rarely have happy families. Janet walked into the monolithic lobby. Her combat boots swapped out for a pair of sensible, polished black loafers, her tactical pants replaced by a tailored black suit that hid the customized Glock 19 resting snugly in a shoulder holster. She moved with the quiet, fluid grace of a ghost. She didn't just walk into a room, she scanned it. 3 security guards, blind spot near the elevator banks. The exits are reinforced glass. Takes 3 rounds of 9mm to shatter. Janet Walker, a smooth, gravelly voice echoed. Marcus stepped out of a private elevator. He looked older than he did in the sandbox. Silver-peppered his close-cropped hair. And he wore a suit that probably cost more than Janet's car. "Marcus," she nodded, her face a mask of professional stoicism. "You said high risk. Let's skip the corporate dance. What's the job?" Marcus sighed, gesturing for her to follow him into the elevator. He swiped a keycard, and the car shot upward, leaving her stomach behind. "Victor Sterling is dying," Marcus said quietly, the hum of the elevator masking his words from any hidden mics. "Pancreatic cancer. He has maybe 6 months." And the moment the doctors gave him his expiration date, the Sterling family civil war began. "I'm a bodyguard, Marcus, not a corporate lawyer. What do I care about a rich family squabbling over stock options?" Marcus turned to her, his eyes dead serious. "They aren't squabbling over stocks, Walker. They're eliminating the competition. Victor has 3 children from his first marriage. Vicious, greedy, and utterly devoid of a moral compass. But Victor changed his will last week. He's leaving the controlling interest of the entire empire to his youngest daughter from his second marriage." "The client," Janet concluded. "Exactly. Maya Sterling, 19 years old. An art student who thinks the world is full of sunshine and rainbows. She has no idea how deep the shark tank is." Marcus paused as the elevator dinged at the 60th floor. 2 days ago, the brakes on Maya's car failed on a mountain road. Her driver died. Maya survived by a miracle. The police called it a mechanical failure. "And you call it an assassination attempt by her older siblings," Janet said, her tactical mind already spinning. "It's a slaughter, Janet. The older siblings have hired professionals. Ex-cartel enforcers. Rogue contractors. They want Maya dead before Victor draws his last breath. If she dies, the empire defaults back to them." The elevator doors slid open, revealing a penthouse that looked like a modern art museum. "I need someone who doesn't just know how to take a bullet," Marcus said, stopping her before she stepped out. "I need someone who knows how to hunt. I need a mother who understands exactly what it means to protect a child at all costs. Victor is paying $2 million, half up front, into an offshore account, tax-free. $2 million. Janet's breath hitched. That was a house in a safe neighborhood. That was a college fund for Nora. That was freedom. Does the kid know her own siblings are trying to butcher her? Janet asked. She's in denial, Marcus replied. Your job is to keep her breathing until Victor passes and the assets are legally locked. You are her shadow. You don't trust the staff. You don't trust the local cops. And you sure as hell don't trust her family. Janet touched the cold steel of her Glock beneath her jacket. I'll take the job, but if things go kinetic, I do it my way. I wouldn't expect anything less. Ranger. Marcus smiled grimly. Welcome to the Sterling family. Maya Sterling was sitting by a massive floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the rain-soaked city. She was small, fragile-looking, with dark hair and pale skin. She wore an oversized sweater, her knees pulled to her chest. She didn't look like a billionaire heiress. She looked like a terrified teenager trapped in a very expensive cage. Janet stepped into the room, her eyes doing a rapid 360-degree sweep. Sniper angles from the building across the street. The glass was bulletproof, but heavily concentrated fire could breach it. 2 exits. 1 panic room. Maya, Marcus said gently. This is Janet Walker. She's going to be your new lead executive protection officer. Maya looked up. Her eyes were red, swollen from crying. She looked at Janet, at the hard lines of her jaw, the intense, unyielding stare of her gray eyes, and the quiet, dangerous stillness of her posture. "You're a woman," Maya said, her voice trembling slightly. "My father usually hires giant men with earpieces." "Giant men make big targets, Maya," Janet said, her voice calm, a stark contrast to the thundering storm outside. "I prefer not to be shot at all." Maya let out a weak, humorless laugh. "Are you going to tell me that my car crash was just an accident, too, like my father's lawyers keep saying?" Janet walked slowly across the room, closing the distance between them. She crouched down so she was eye level with the girl. For a brief second, she didn't see an heiress. She saw a scared kid. She saw a flash of Nora, crying after waking up from a nightmare. The maternal instinct flared up inside Janet, hot and fierce, mixing with the cold calculus of her combat training. "I'm not going to lie to you, Maya," Janet said softly, but with a titanium core of absolute certainty. "People are coming for you. People who share your blood. They want you dead because of a number on a piece of paper." Maya gasped, tears spilling over her cheeks. Hearing it spoken out loud made the nightmare real. "Then I'm already dead. You don't know my brothers. You don't know what they are capable of." "No, I don't," Janet replied, leaning in closer. "But they don't know me. I fought monsters in places where God doesn't look. Your brothers are just greedy men in expensive suits. From this second forward, you don't go to the bathroom without my clearance. You don't eat anything I haven't cleared. You don't breathe air I haven't checked." Janet stood up, her eyes locking onto the door as a shadow moved past the frosted glass of the hallway. Her hand instinctively hovered near her lapel, inches from her weapon. "I have a daughter of my own," Janet said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, her eyes never leaving the door. "And I'm going back home to her tonight. Which means I am not dying today. And neither are you." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the penthouse swung open. Two men walked in. The first was a lawyer, carrying a briefcase, but the second man, Janet's blood ran cold. He was dressed as a sterling security guard, but his boots were tied in a specific military paracord knot. His posture was too aggressive. His hands were empty, but his right hand was hovering too close to his hip. He wasn't a corporate guard. He was a shooter. And his eyes were locked dead onto Maya. "Gun!" Janet roared, her maternal instinct and killer training colliding in a split second. She didn't think, she reacted. She shoved Maya violently to the floor just as the fake security guard drew a suppressed pistol and the first bullet shattered the heavy crystal vase right where Maya's head had been a fraction of a second before. The Civil War hadn't just begun. It had arrived at their front door. And Janet Walker was about to show the Sterling family what real violence looked like. The sound of a suppressed gunshot inside a penthouse doesn't sound like a movie. It sounds like a sharp, violent whip cracking next to your ear, followed immediately by the terrifying tinkle of falling crystal. Before the fake guard could even correct his aim for a second shot, Janet Walker was already moving. Her body bypassed conscious thought, letting years of brutal, muscle memory conditioning take the wheel. From her crouched position over Maya, Janet drew her Glock 19. It wasn't a panicked yank, it was a smooth, oiled motion. Bang, bang, 2 rounds center mass. The fake guard stumbled backward, his Kevlar vest absorbing the blunt force, but knocking the wind out of him. He grunted, raising his weapon again. Bang! The third round caught him exactly an inch above the bridge of his nose. The classic Mozambique drill. The man dropped like a puppet with its strings cut, his blood pooling against the pristine, white marble floor of the sterling penthouse. The lawyer dropped his briefcase and screamed, scrambling backward like a crab. "Shut up and get down," Janet barked, her voice cutting through the panic like a serrated blade. She didn't look at the dead man. She looked at the door. One shooter meant a breach. A breach meant a team. Beneath her, Maya was hyperventilating, her eyes wide and fixed on the spreading pool of blood. She was frozen in the kind of pure, paralyzing terror that gets civilians killed in war zones. Janet grabbed Maya by the collar of her expensive sweater and hauled her to her feet, shoving her against the solid mahogany wall, out of the fatal funnel of the doorway. "Maya, look at me," Janet commanded. Maya's eyes were darting wildly. There's blood." Janet gripped the girl's face with her free hand, forcing eye contact. "Listen to me," Janet said, her voice dropping to a fierce, steady whisper. "You are breathing. You are alive. But if you freeze right now, we both die, and my daughter grows up without a mother. I am not letting that happen. Do you understand me?" The mention of Janet's daughter seemed to snap something into place inside Maya's panicked brain. She swallowed hard, tears streaking her face, and gave a jerky, terrified nod. "Good. Stay behind me. Step where I step." Janet checked the hallway. Clear. For about 3 seconds. Suddenly, the fire alarm began to blare, a deafening, strobe-lit nightmare. Smart, Janet thought. The alarm masks the sound of gunfire and causes panic in the lower floors. Slowing down police response. "We need the elevator," Maya stammered, covering her ears. "Elevators are coffins," Janet replied coldly, moving them swiftly down the corridor. "They'll cut the power the second we get in, trap us, and drop gas or a grenade down the shaft. We take the stairs." As they reached the heavy steel door of the emergency stairwell, Janet held up a fist. "Stop." She pressed her ear against the cold metal. Faintly, beneath the wailing alarm, she heard it, the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots marching up the stairs. They were being boxed in. A hit squad coming up. And nowhere to go but the roof, which was a dead end. They were trapped in a 60-story glass cage. Janet looked around the luxurious hallway. Her eyes landed on the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-slicked Seattle skyline. "Maya," Janet said, her voice eerily calm, "how much do you trust me? I don't even know you." Maya sobbed. "Good enough," Janet muttered. She raised her Glock and fired 3 rapid shots into the corner of the reinforced window. The bulletproof glass didn't shatter, but it spider-webbed violently. Janet took 2 steps back and launched a brutal, military front kick directly into the weakened center. The entire pane blew out, sucking the warm air of the hallway into the freezing, howling wind of the Seattle storm. Maya screamed as Janet grabbed her harness. "Time to jump, kid." The wind roared into the hallway, bringing the freezing sting of rain with it. Maya looked out the shattered window. 60 stories below, the headlights of cars looked like tiny, slow-moving fireflies. The drop was a sheer, terrifying plunge into nothingness. "Are you insane?" Maya shrieked, fighting against Janet's grip. "We can't jump. We don't have parachutes. We aren't jumping down. We're swinging across." Janet yelled over the wind. She pointed outside. 3 feet to the left of the window was an exterior maintenance track, a metal ladder system used by window washers. running vertically down the side of the skyscraper, hidden within a sleek architectural groove. When I say go, you wrap your arms and legs around me like a monkey. You do not let go, even if you feel like you're falling. Understand? The stairwell door behind them shuddered. Someone was trying to breach it. Heavy thuds echoed as a battering ram hit the steel. Thump, thump. Understand? Janet roared. Yes, yes, Maya cried. Now. Maya leapt onto Janet's back, locking her arms around the bodyguard's neck and her legs around her waist. Janet didn't hesitate. She didn't look down. She stepped onto the window ledge, the howling wind threatening to peel them right off the glass, and launched herself sideways into the abyss. For one agonizing second, there was nothing but gravity, the stomach-churning sensation of freefall. Maya screamed a sound so primal it scraped her throat raw. Then, a violent, bone-rattling jerk. Janet's hands slammed onto the freezing, wet metal of the maintenance ladder. The impact sent a shockwave of pain up her arms, nearly tearing her shoulders from their sockets. The added weight of the teenager almost broke her grip, but Janet's fingers locked onto the rungs like steel vices. They dangled there, 60 stories up, swaying in the violent storm. Don't look down, Janet grunted, her muscles screaming in protest. Just breathe, Maya, I've got you. Thwack! A bullet sparked against the metal frame inches from Janet's head. She looked up, through the shattered window they had just escaped. Two men in black tactical gear were leaning out, aiming assault rifles into the rain. Climb down, fast, Janet ordered, pushing Maya off her back and onto the ladder beneath her. Maya, fueled by pure adrenaline and the visceral fear of death, scrambled down the wet rungs. Janet followed, acting as a human shield between the girl and the shooters above. The rain was their only ally, blinding the mercenaries and throwing off their aim. Bullets pinged and whined off the glass and steel around them. Suddenly, Janet felt a sharp, white-hot bite tear through her left bicep. She hissed in pain, her left arm buckling for a fraction of a second. Blood, warm and sticky, began to mix with the cold rain running down her sleeve. Not today, Janet told herself, gritting her teeth against the searing agony. Nora is waiting. I am going home. Keep moving, Maya, don't stop, Janet shouted, her voice tight with pain. They descended floor after floor, their hands blistering, their bodies soaked to the bone. By the time they reached the 15th floor, the shooters had abandoned the window, likely taking the elevators down to cut them off at the ground level. Janet's arm was throbbing, a deep, rhythmic ache that signaled a clean through-and-through wound. Not fatal, but it was going to slow her down. Finally, they reached the roof of the adjoining parking garage, a brutalist concrete structure sitting 10 stories above the street. Janet dropped the last 10 feet, rolling on the wet concrete to absorb the impact, before catching Maya as she dropped. Maya collapsed onto her hands and knees, throwing up from the sheer terror and physical exhaustion. Janet didn't have time to comfort her. She ripped a strip of fabric from the hem of her ruined suit jacket and tied a tight, brutal tourniquet around her bleeding bicep, pulling it with her teeth. Get up, Janet said, her chest heaving as she pulled her Glock back out. We made it to the garage. But they know we're here. We have exactly 2 minutes to steal a car and disappear before this whole block gets locked down. Maya looked up, wiping her mouth. She looked at Janet's bleeding arm, then up at the towering, dark silhouette of her father's building. The innocence in the teenager's eyes was gone. washed away by the Seattle rain and the blood of the men who wanted her dead. "Can you drive?" Maya asked, her voice shaking, but finding a new, desperate strength. Janet gave a grim, blood-stained smile. "Kid, you're about to see how a ranger drives." The parking garage was a maze of concrete pillars and flickering fluorescent lights. Janet's eyes swept the rows of parked cars, instantly discarding the Teslas and late-model luxury sedans. They were rolling computers, packed with GPS trackers and electronic locks that could be remotely disabled. She needed analog. She needed raw, dumb metal. Her eyes locked onto a beat-up 1998 Jeep Cherokee parked near the stairwell. "Perfect. Stay low," Janet hissed to Maya, dragging her toward the vehicle. Janet didn't bother checking the door handle. She wrapped her jacket around her right fist and smashed the driver's side window with a brutal, calculated strike. She reached in, unlocked the door, and shoved Maya into the passenger seat. Brushing the broken glass off the worn driver's seat, Janet slid in. Her left arm screamed in agony, the makeshift tourniquet tight and unyielding. She ripped off the plastic casing under the steering column with her bare hands, exposing a nest of wires. "What are you doing?" Maya asked, her breath fogging the cold windshield. "Stealing a car," Janet grunted. She stripped the red and yellow wires with her teeth, twisting them together until the dashboard lit up, then sparked the ignition wire. The old V6 engine roared to life with a rusty cough. "Put your seatbelt on, now." Janet slammed the Jeep into drive and floored it. The tires squealed against the slick concrete as they tore down the spiral ramp. Level 9, Level 8, Level 7. Suddenly, Janet's encrypted earpiece crackled to life. It was Marcus. "Walker, I've got multiple breach alarms on the 60th floor. The cameras are blind. Tell me you have the package." "I have her," Janet yelled over the roaring engine, taking a corner so fast the Jeep drifted, nearly kissing the concrete wall. "We took the exterior maintenance ladder to the garage. We're in a vehicle, heading for the exit." "Copy that. Get to Safe House Delta in Bellevue. I'm sending an extraction team to meet you." Level 3, Level 2. As Janet whipped around the final corner toward the ground floor exit, her combat instincts flared. The exit barrier was smashed. Idling in the shadows just outside the gate were two massive, black Chevy Suburbans. They weren't moving, they were waiting. "Hold on," Janet roared. Instead of braking, she slammed her foot harder on the gas. The Jeep surged forward like a battering ram. The mercenaries in the Suburbans realized too late that she wasn't going to stop. Janet aimed the heavy steel grille of the Jeep directly at the rear axle of the blocking Suburban. The impact was deafening. Metal crunched, glass exploded, and the heavy SUV was spun violently out of the way, its alarm blaring. Janet wrestled the steering wheel, fighting the shock of the collision, and blasted out into the torrential Seattle rain. She checked her rearview mirror. The second Suburban was already peeling out, giving chase. "How did they know we were in the garage?" Maya screamed over the sound of the rain and sirens. "You said nobody takes the outside ladder." Janet's eyes darkened. Her heart pounded, not just from adrenaline, but from a cold, creeping realization. The hit squad shouldn't have known to cut them off at the garage exit. Not unless someone had told them. Not unless someone monitoring the building's exterior cameras was feeding them real-time intel. She ripped the encrypted earpiece out of her ear. "Marcus," she whispered to herself. Whether her old commander was the mole, or whether his entire system had been compromised by the Sterling family's billions. It didn't matter. The safety net was gone. Janet rolled down the window and threw the earpiece out into the storm. "Where are we going?" Maya asked, terrified by the sudden silence in the car. "Aren't we going to the safe house?" "No," Janet said, her voice hard as granite. She took a sharp left, driving into the oncoming lane of traffic to dodge a city bus, causing a symphony of angry horns. "Whoever wants you dead just bought my security firm. We're entirely off the grid now. Trust no one." Janet executed a flawless, high-speed J-turn into a narrow, twisting alleyway, killing the headlights. The black Suburban roared past the alley entrance seconds later, completely missing them in the downpour. They sat in the dark, the rain drumming heavily on the roof. Janet leaned her head against the steering wheel, taking a ragged breath. "So, what do we do now?" Maya asked, her voice trembling. Janet looked up, her eyes softening for the first time since the shooting started. She looked at the dashboard clock. It was 2:45 p.m. "Now," Janet said quietly, "I have to go pick up my daughter from school." Public School 118 was a crumbling brick building in a neighborhood the city had long forgotten. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle by the time the stolen Jeep idled across the street. Janet sat in the driver's seat, her breathing shallow. She had found an old, oversized flannel shirt in the back of the Jeep and put it on over her tactical gear to hide the blood soaking through her left sleeve. She looked pale, exhausted, and incredibly dangerous. "Stay down," Janet ordered Maya, who was huddled in the backseat. "Keep the doors locked. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, or if anyone besides me touches that door handle, you climb into the front seat and you drive. Do not stop for anything." Maya nodded, her eyes wide as she watched the hardened bodyguard step out into the rain. Through the tinted window, Maya watched Janet walk toward the school gates. She saw the way Janet moved, a slight limp, her left arm held rigidly against her side, her right hand never straying far from the hidden holster beneath the flannel. But as the school bell rang and a flood of children poured out, Maya saw something that shifted her entire worldview. A little girl with pigtails, wearing a bright yellow raincoat that was a size too big, came running out of the double doors. Janet dropped to her knees right there on the wet pavement. She didn't care about the mud. She didn't care about the pain in her arm. She caught the little girl in a one-armed embrace, burying her face in the child's shoulder. Even from across the street, Maya could see the fierce, desperate love radiating from the woman. This wasn't a cold-blooded killer. This was a mother who had just walked through hell, and her only reward was the smell of her daughter's hair. For the first time in her pampered, isolated life, Maya felt a deep, crushing sense of shame. Her billionaire siblings were tearing the city apart over stock portfolios and trust funds. Meanwhile, this woman was bleeding out in an alley just to keep the lights on for her kid. A few minutes later, the Jeep door opened. Janet lifted the little girl into the back seat next to Maya. "Nora, sweetie, this is Maya," Janet said, her voice lighter, stripping away the harsh military gravel. "She's a friend from work. She's going to be staying with us for a little bit." Nora looked at Maya with big, curious brown eyes. "Hi, are you a security guard too?" Maya forced a smile, feeling tears prick the corners of her eyes. "No, sweetie, I'm just a girl your mom is helping." "My mom helps everybody," Nora said proudly, kicking her little rain boots, "but she's clumsy. Look, She spilled ketchup on her sleeve. Maya glanced at Janet's arm. The dark red blood was seeping through the flannel. Janet caught Maya's eye in the rearview mirror and gave a microscopic shake of her head. "Don't tell her." "Yeah, bug." Janet smiled weakly, putting the car in drive. "Mommy had a clumsy lunch. Let's go home." They didn't go to Janet's apartment. Instead, Janet drove them to the industrial outskirts of the city, pulling up to an abandoned, overgrown water treatment facility. She led them through a rusted chain-link fence, down a steep concrete stairwell hidden beneath a heavy metal grate, and into the earth. It was a decommissioned Cold War-era fallout shelter. Janet had found it years ago and spent her meager savings stocking it with MREs, meals ready to eat, bottled water, and a medical kit. It was cold, damp, and smelled like old concrete. There was a single cot in the corner and a battery-powered lantern that cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. "It's not the penthouse," Janet said, locking the heavy steel blast door behind them with a definitive clang. She finally let her tough facade drop, leaning heavily against the wall and clutching her bleeding arm. "But it's off the grid. No cell service, no cameras, no windows. We're ghosts." Nora ran over to the cot and immediately pulled out her worn stuffed bear from her backpack, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Maya stood in the center of the bunker. She looked at the meager supplies. She looked at the damp walls. Then, she looked at Janet, who had just stripped off the flannel shirt, revealing a horrific, bleeding bullet wound. The billionaire heiress walked over to the medical kit on the table, opened it, and pulled out a roll of gauze. She walked back to Janet, her hands shaking, but her jaw set with newfound determination. "Sit down, Janet," Maya said softly. "You've been protecting me all day. Let me help you now." Janet looked at the young woman, surprised. Slowly, the weary mother nodded and sat down, letting the heiress bandage her wounds as the storm raged on above them. High above the rain-swept streets of Seattle, the air in the Sterling Tower penthouse smelled of ozone, shattered glass, and expensive bleach. A team of discreet cleaners was already scrubbing the dead assassin's blood out of the Italian marble. Richard Sterling stood by the temporary wooden hoarding that covered the blown-out window, staring out at the city he believed he already owned. He was 35, impeccably groomed, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than most people made in a year. In his right hand, he swirled a glass of 50-year-old Macallan Scotch. $2 million, Richard said, his voice a low, venomous purr. He didn't turn around. "We paid the Jimenez cartel $2 million to arrange a simple, quiet mechanical failure. When that failed, we paid another $1 million for a tactical breach. And what do we have to show for it? A dead contractor, a shattered window, and a missing sister." Victoria Sterling snapped, pacing across the room. She was 2 years younger than Richard, with sharp, bird-like features and a gaze cold enough to freeze nitrogen. The old man's heart monitor is beeping slower by the hour. If Victor dies before Maya is eliminated, the board executes the new will. She gets the empire. We get the scraps. The cartel sent thugs. A new voice echoed from the shadows of the hallway. The voice was like grinding stones, deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of emotion. Both siblings turned as a man stepped into the light of the crystal chandelier. He didn't wear a suit. He wore dark, tactical clothing that seemed to absorb the light. He was tall, lean, with a jagged scar running from his left ear down to his jawline. His eyes were the color of dirty ice. His name was Silas, and he didn't exist on any government database. He was a ghost, a former elite operative who had realized that killing for his country paid far less than killing for the highest bidder. Your cartel friends rely on volume and fear, Silas said, walking over to the massive mahogany dining table. He tossed a high-tech tablet onto the polished wood. The woman who took your sister out of this building doesn't feel fear. And she certainly isn't intimidated by volume. Richard set his drink down, his jaw tightening. You watched the security footage? I analyzed it, Silas corrected, tapping the screen. The video played, a grainy, silent capture from a hallway camera just before Janet shot out the glass. Silas paused the frame, zooming in on Janet's face just as she shoved Maya behind her. The stance, the muzzle discipline, the way she assessed the fatal funnel of the doorway before dropping your man. Silas murmured, almost with a twisted sense of admiration. That isn't a bodyguard. That's a Tier 1 predator. You hired a bunch of amateurs to hunt a wolf. Victoria crossed her arms, unimpressed. Can you find them or not? Silas? We are paying you an exorbitant retainer. Silas didn't look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the frozen image of Janet Walker on the screen. A slow, terrifying smile crept across his scarred face. Oh, I can find her, Silas said softly. I know her. Helmand Province, 2018. We called her the Wraith because she could pull wounded men out of firefights where nothing else survived. I always wondered what happened to her. Richard stepped forward. You have history? We have unfinished business, Silas replied, his eyes gleaming with a cold, predatory hunger. He picked up his tablet and turned toward the door. Cancel the cartel contracts. Pull your men off the streets. They'll just get in my way. By tomorrow morning, Maya Sterling will be dead. And the Wraith will finally be a ghost. The bunker was practically a tomb. It was buried 30 feet beneath the rusted ruins of the water treatment plant. Insulated by thousands of tons of concrete and damp earth, the only sound was the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of condensation falling from the low ceiling into a metal bucket. Maya sat on the edge of the cot, pulling a rough, wool blanket up to her chin. She was shivering, though she wasn't sure if it was from the biting cold of the underground room or the shock of the day's violence finally settling into her bones. Across the small space, Janet sat on a rusted metal folding chair, her back perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on the heavy steel blast door. Her Glock was resting on her thigh, her hand resting lightly over the grip. She had taken painkillers from the medical kit, but Maya could tell the woman was in agony. Her face was pale, glistening with a thin sheen of cold sweat, and the new bandages on her arm were already blooming with a faint pink stain. On the cot next to Maya, little Nora tossed and turned, her stuffed bear clutched tightly to her chest. Suddenly, Nora let out a soft whimper. Mommy, I'm freezing. Janet's head snapped toward the cot. She tried to stand up, but her left leg gave out. A delayed reaction to the blood loss and the brutal physical toll of the escape. She caught herself on the table, gritting her teeth so hard her jaw popped. I've got her, Maya said quickly, scrambling off the cot. Janet looked at the billionaire heiress, hesitation flashing in her gray eyes. But her body was failing her, and she had no choice. She nodded slowly, sinking back into the metal chair. Maya knelt beside the little girl. She placed a trembling hand on Nora's forehead and gasped. Janet, she's burning up. She has a fever. The rain, Janet whispered, closing her eyes in a rare moment of defeat. The cold down here. Her immune system, it's not great. The stress doesn't help. Maya didn't panic. She remembered what the nurses used to do when she was a child. Sick in her massive, lonely bedroom while her father was away on business trips. She grabbed a clean rag from the medical kit, poured some bottled water over it, and wrung it out. Gently, tenderly, Maya began to dab the cool, damp cloth against Nora's forehead, her cheeks, and her neck. "It's okay, sweetie," Maya whispered, brushing a damp curl away from the little girl's eyes. "I'm right here. Your mom is right here. We're going to keep you safe." Nora's breathing hitched, but she leaned into the cool touch of the cloth. "Are the bad men going to find us?" she mumbled in her sleep. Maya looked up at Janet. The hardened veteran was watching them, her eyes heavy with a mixture of exhaustion and profound gratitude. "No," Maya answered the child, her voice gaining a surprising firmness. "They aren't." For a long time, the only sound was the dripping water and Nora's ragged breathing. Maya kept replacing the cool cloth, ignoring the dirt on the floor and the freezing air. "Why do you do it?" Maya asked quietly, breaking the heavy silence. She didn't look at Janet, she kept her eyes on Nora. "You have her. Why take jobs where people shoot at you?" Janet let out a dark, breathy chuckle. "You think I want to? Kid? I spent 3 tours patching up kids who got blown to pieces for a flag. When I came back, the country gave me a medal, a pat on the back, and a disability check that doesn't cover rent. The electric company doesn't take medals as payment." Maya stopped wiping Nora's forehead. The words hit her like a physical blow. She thought about her own life, the private jets, the credit cards with no limits, the superficial arguments over gallery spaces. She had lived in a bubble made of gold, completely blind to the fact that people like Janet were bleeding just to survive in the dirt below. "I didn't know," Maya whispered, her voice thick with shame. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be," Janet said, her eyes locked on the steel door. "It's not your fault you were born into the castle. But the walls are coming down now. You need to decide who you're going to be when the dust settles." Maya looked down at Nora. The little girl's breathing was finally slowing, the fever breaking slightly under Maya's persistent care. The heiress felt a protective instinct flare up inside her, something she had never felt before. Maya stood up, walked over to Janet, and looked the lethal, broken woman dead in the eye. "If we get out of this, when we get out of this," Maya corrected herself, her voice shaking but filled with an iron resolve. "I'm taking control of my father's company. I'm not running anymore, and the first thing I'm doing is setting up a blind trust for Nora." Janet stared at her, stunned. $20 million, Maya said, her chin raised, locked tight, untouchable by anyone but her. "She goes to the best schools. She lives in a house with heat. And you never had to take a bullet for anyone ever again. That is my promise to you." Janet looked at the young woman. The terrified teenager from the penthouse was gone. The fire of the Sterling bloodline was finally showing. But unlike her siblings, Maya's fire was fueled by empathy, not greed. Janet gave a slow, respectful nod. "Then I guess I better make sure you live long enough to sign the paperwork." The Seattle rain showed no mercy, washing the city streets into a blurry canvas of gray and neon. But Silas didn't need clear skies to hunt. He was a creature of the storm. He stood perfectly still in the narrow, trash-littered alleyway where the stolen 1998 Jeep Cherokee had been abandoned. The police hadn't found it yet, Silas's network of corrupt dispatchers and street informants was infinitely faster than city law enforcement. He shined a heavy tactical flashlight into the driver's side window. The glass was shattered. The ignition wires violently ripped out and spliced. Silas smiled grimly. Classic military field expediency. He opened the door and leaned in. The metallic smell of copper hit him immediately. He ran a gloved finger over the dark, sticky stain soaking into the fabric of the driver's seat. He brought his finger up to the light. She's bleeding, he thought. Heavy blood loss. Left arm or shoulder, judging by the spray pattern on the door panel. Silas stepped back from the vehicle, his icy eyes scanning the surrounding neighborhood. It was a lower-income residential district. Nothing but cracked sidewalks, cheap bodegas, and his gaze locked onto the crumbling brick building 3 blocks down. Public School 118. Silas pulled out his encrypted phone and dialed Richard Sterling. The billionaire answered on the first ring. "Tell me you have them," Richard demanded, his voice tight with anxiety. "I have her trajectory," Silas replied, his voice a low, soothing rumble that completely contrasted the violence in his eyes. "Your sister is irrelevant right now. Walker is the key, and Walker made a mistake. She didn't go to ground immediately. She stopped." "Stopped for what?" "A child," Silas said, stepping out of the alley and walking slowly toward the school. "I checked her old military psych evaluations. Walker has a daughter, 7 years old. She picked the kid up before disappearing." "A kid?" Richard scoffed. "So she's carrying extra baggage. That makes her slower." "It makes her unpredictable to you," Silas corrected coldly. "But predictable to me. A wounded mother in a cold, damp city with a kid in tow? She needs 3 things: sterile bandages, military-grade painkillers, and pediatric antibiotics. She won't risk a hospital. And she can't use an over-the-counter pharmacy without triggering the facial recognition software I just uploaded to the city's grid." "So where does she go?" Silas looked down at the neon reflection in a puddle. "She goes underground. She goes to the only people who don't ask questions. I'm dispatching my strike teams to every black market trauma clinic and fixer in the Seattle underbelly. By midnight, Walker will walk right into my jaws." The air inside the bunker was thick and suffocating. Nora's fever hadn't broken. If anything, she was getting hotter, her small body trembling violently under the wool blankets. Janet looked at her watch. 8 p.m. The medical kit was entirely depleted of anything stronger than ibuprofen. And that wasn't going to stop a severe infection. Janet's own arm was throbbing with a sickening rhythm, the wound demanding proper antibiotics and stitches before sepsis set in. She stood up, ignoring the shooting pain in her leg. She pulled a bulky, dark green rain slicker over her tactical gear, perfectly concealing the Glock 19 and 2 spare magazines. "Lock the door behind me," Janet told Maya, handing her a heavy iron crowbar. "Do not open it unless you hear 3 knocks." A pause, and 2 more knocks. "If anyone else tries to breach, I swing for the head," Maya finished, her knuckles white as she gripped the iron bar. The terrified heiress was gone. A desperate, focused survivor had taken her place. Janet nodded. "I'll be back in an hour." 40 minutes later, Janet was navigating the labyrinthine lower levels of Pike Place Market. Above her, the famous neon clock glowed in the rain, and tourists still snapped photos of the fishmongers closing up shop. But down here, in the damp, brick-lined subterranean corridors known as Post Alley, the real commerce happened. She slipped into the back door of a seemingly abandoned antique shop. Inside, a man named Doc Higgins, a former Navy corpsman who had lost his license a decade ago, was counting a stack of crumpled bills. "Walker," Doc grunted, barely looking up, "you look like hell. Heard someone blew out a window at the Sterling Tower today. I need pediatric amoxicillin, strong, suture kit, lidocaine, and military-grade coagulant," Janet demanded, sliding a roll of cash, taken from the dead assassin in the penthouse, onto the counter. "Now, Doc." Doc looked at the cash. Then at the pale, sweating woman. He didn't ask questions. He quickly bagged the items. 10 minutes ago, some very expensive-looking men started asking the street rats if a bleeding woman had come looking for meds. "You've got heat, Janet. Bad heat." Janet snatched the bag. "Thanks for the warning." She stepped back out into the dimly lit cobblestone alley. The rain was deafening, masking the sound of footsteps. But Janet didn't need to hear them. Her combat intuition, honed by years of surviving ambushes in Helmand, screamed at her. The alley was entirely empty. Too empty. The homeless folks who usually slept near the steam vents were gone. 3 contacts. Her brain registered instantly as shadows detached themselves from the brick walls at both ends of the alley. They were dressed in dark raincoats, their hands buried in their pockets. They moved with the synchronized, lethal grace of former special forces. Silas's men. They had boxed her in. Janet couldn't draw her gun. A shootout here would bring the Seattle Police Department down on her in minutes. Exposing Maya and Nora. This had to be quiet. This had to be intimate. The closest mercenary lunged, pulling a silenced pistol from his coat. Janet didn't retreat, she exploded forward. She dropped under his line of fire, driving her right elbow viciously into his floating ribs. He grunted, his aim thrown off. Before he could recover, Janet drew her combat knife from her boot. With a fluid, horrifyingly precise motion, she drove the blade upward, slipping it perfectly between his Kevlar vest plates and into his lung. He collapsed without a sound, his blood washing down the cobblestones. The second man charged, drawing a heavy combat blade of his own. He swung wildly at Janet's head. She parried with her left arm. The impact sent a blinding flash of agony through her gunshot wound, bringing her to her knees. The mercenary smiled, raising his knife for the killing blow. But Janet wasn't defeated. She was just changing her angle. From her knees, she unholstered her Glock, pressed the muzzle directly against the man's kneecap, and fired. The crack of the unsuppressed gunshot echoed off the brick walls like a cannon blast. The man screamed, his leg shattering instantly. The third mercenary, caught off guard by the sheer volume of the shot, hesitated for a microsecond. That was all Janet needed. She snapped her aim up and put 2 hollow point rounds squarely into the center of his chest. He slammed backward into the brick wall and slid down, dead before he hit the ground. Sirens began to wail in the distance. The gunshot had alerted the city. Janet stood up, panting heavily, rain and blood mixing on her face. Her left arm was completely numb now, her body running on pure, toxic adrenaline. She grabbed the bag of medicine from the wet ground, stepping over the groaning man with the shattered knee. She leaned down, her face inches from his terrified eyes. "Tell Silas," Janet whispered, her voice colder than the Seattle rain, "that if he comes near my daughter, I won't just kill him. I'll take his soul." Janet disappeared into the shadows of the market just as the red and blue lights of the police cruisers flooded the alley. She had the medicine, but the hunt was no longer a secret. The whole city was about to become a war zone. 3 heavy knocks against the steel door. A suffocating, 2-second pause. Then, 2 more knocks. Inside the bunker, Maya let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for an hour. Her hands were slick with cold sweat as she dropped the heavy iron crowbar and threw the deadbolt. The massive door swung open with a heavy, metallic groan. Janet stumbled inside. Maya gasped, stumbling backward. The woman who stood in the doorway barely looked human anymore. Janet's green rain slicker was slashed open at the side, soaked in a horrifying mixture of Seattle rain and dark, arterial blood. Her face was pale as a ghost. Her jaw clenched in silent agony. And her eyes were wide, wild, and completely hollowed out by the violence she had just committed. She looked exactly like what Silas had called her, a wraith. Janet didn't say a word. She kicked the heavy door shut, locking it with her blood-stained right hand. She practically threw the plastic bag of medicine onto the metal table and collapsed into the folding chair, her head dropping back as she fought off unconsciousness. "Mommy?" The small, weak voice cut through the silence like a razor blade. Nora was sitting up on the cot, her stuffed bear clutched to her chest. The fever had broken slightly, just enough for her to wake up. She looked at her mother. She saw the blood dripping from the torn raincoat onto the concrete floor. She saw the terrifying, dead look in Janet's eyes. Nora shrank back against the concrete wall, pulling her knees to her chest. Her lower lip trembled. "Mommy, you're scary." The words hit Janet harder than the bullet in her arm. The hardened combat veteran, the woman who had just butchered 3 elite mercenaries without blinking, shattered. A choked, agonizing sob ripped from Janet's throat. She tried to stand up, to reach for her daughter. But she looked down at her hands. They were stained red. She was a monster, a predator. How could she touch something as pure as her child with hands like these? "Nora, Janet choked on the words, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, mixing with the rain and dirt on her face. "I had to. Mommy had to get your medicine." Nora started to cry, terrified by the blood, the dark room, and the stranger her mother had become. Maya moved before she even realized what she was doing. The billionaire heiress stepped between the broken soldier and the terrified child. She sat on the edge of the cot and gently wrapped her arms around Nora, pulling the little girl into a warm embrace. "Shush, it's okay, Nora," Maya whispered fiercely, stroking the child's hair. "It's okay. Look at me." Nora buried her face in Maya's sweater, sobbing softly. "Your mom isn't scary," Maya said, her voice steady and clear, echoing in the damp bunker. "Your mom is a superhero. Do you know what happens when a superhero has to fight the bad guys to save the people she loves? She gets a little messy. She gets hurt, because she's brave." Maya looked over her shoulder at Janet. The formidable bodyguard was weeping silently, her head bowed in utter defeat. "She went out into the storm to get your medicine," Maya continued, holding Nora tight. "She fought the monsters so they couldn't come in here. That blood, it just means she loves you more than anything in the whole world." Nora stopped crying. She sniffled, slowly turning her head to look at her mother. Janet had managed to strip off the ruined slicker. She was furiously wiping her hands with an alcohol pad, trying desperately to scrub the violence off her skin. Nora slipped out of Maya's arms. She padded softly across the cold concrete floor in her socks. She stood in front of Janet, looking at the horrific gunshot wound on her mother's arm. Then, the little girl reached out her tiny, clean hands and wrapped them around her mother's trembling, blood-stained fingers. "Does it hurt, Mommy?" Nora whispered. Janet fell to her knees, pulling Nora into her chest, burying her face in her daughter's shoulder as she broke down completely. "Only a little, baby, only a little." Maya turned away, giving them the moment, her own tears falling freely now. She unpacked the medicine, her hands moving with purpose. She prepared the pediatric antibiotics for Nora, and the lidocaine and suture kit for Janet. The heiress had never stitched a wound in her life. But tonight, in this dark, freezing hole, she was going to learn. It was 3 a.m. The bunker was dead silent. Nora's fever had finally broken completely, thanks to the heavy dose of amoxicillin, and she was sleeping soundly on the cot. Maya sat on the floor nearby, exhausted, her hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of sewing up Janet's torn bicep. Janet was awake. She sat in the metal chair, staring blankly at the reinforced steel door. She had taken a brutal dose of military-grade painkillers. Her left arm was heavily bandaged and strapped tightly to her chest in a makeshift sling. She only had one good arm left. Suddenly, Janet's eyes narrowed. The ambient sound of the bunker, the rhythmic dripping of water, had changed. A fine dusting of dirt and rust cascaded from the concrete ceiling, landing softly on the metal table. Janet's combat instincts flared like a siren. She stood up instantly, the painkillers masking the agony in her shoulder. She grabbed her Glock with her right hand. "Maya," Janet hissed, her voice a razor-sharp whisper. "Wake her up, now." Maya snapped awake, instantly reading the terror in Janet's posture. She scrambled to the cot and gently shook Nora. "Sweetie, wake up, we have to go. Playtime is over." Hiss. A blindingly bright, white-hot spark erupted from the edges of the heavy steel blast door. The smell of burning metal and ozone instantly flooded the small room. "Thermite," Janet muttered, her blood running cold. Silas's men hadn't just found them, they had brought heavy breaching equipment. They were burning right through the heavy deadbolts. The steel door began to glow a terrifying, angry red. "Back wall. Move the cot," Janet barked. Maya grabbed the heavy metal frame of the cot and dragged it aside with a frantic burst of hysterical strength. Beneath it, hidden flush against the concrete floor, was a rusted iron grate. "It's an old overflow drainage pipe," Janet said, tossing Maya a heavy flashlight. "It connects to the city's storm drain network. It's tight, it's flooded, and it smells like death. You take Nora down there and you run. Do not stop until you hit the main aqueduct." "What about you?" Maya screamed over the deafening hiss of the melting steel. Smoke was filling the bunker, making it hard to breathe. "I have to buy you time," Janet yelled. She was already moving to the metal table. She grabbed 3 remaining bottles of highly flammable cleaning solvent she had stored in the bunker. Taping them together with duct tape, she jammed a roadside flare into the center of the bundle. An improvised, devastating incendiary bomb. "Mommy," Nora cried, clinging to Maya's leg as the heiress pulled the heavy iron grate open. Janet ran over. Dropping to one knee, she grabbed Nora by the shoulders, her one good hand gripping the child fiercely. "Listen to me, Nora. You are a soldier's daughter. You are brave. You stay with Maya. Mommy is right behind you." She looked up at Maya. The two women shared a look of absolute understanding. The 19-year-old heiress and the hardened veteran had forged an unbreakable bond in the blood and dirt of this room. "Keep her safe, Maya," Janet whispered. "With my life," Maya swore. She picked Nora up and dropped down into the dark, foul-smelling darkness of the drainage pipe. Bang! The thermite finished its job. A massive, concussive kick hit the steel door from the outside, blowing it off its melted hinges. The heavy slab of metal crashed onto the bunker floor in a cloud of thick, toxic smoke. 3 heavily armed mercenaries stormed into the room, their assault rifles raised, sweeping the corners with laser sights. They expected terrified women cowering in the dark. Instead, they found Janet Walker standing calmly in the center of the room. She held the lit roadside flare in her teeth, casting a demonic red glow over her pale, scarred face. In her right hand, she held her Glock. In her left, tucked into the sling, was the bundle of explosive solvents. She spat the flare directly onto the bundle of chemicals and kicked it hard across the concrete floor, sliding it perfectly between the legs of the lead mercenary. "Welcome to my house, boys," Janet sneered. She fired one shot directly into the flare, igniting the chemicals instantly, and dove headfirst into the open drainage pipe just as the bunker erupted into a blinding ball of hellfire. The blast wave threw Janet violently down the slick, algae-covered pipe, the screams of the burning mercenaries echoing behind her as she plummeted into the pitch-black abyss of the Seattle underground. The Seattle storm drain system was a subterranean nightmare of rushing, freezing black water and the suffocating stench of decay. For 2 agonizing hours, Janet, Maya, and Nora waded waist-deep through the darkness. Janet moved like a machine, her right hand gripping her Glock, the flashlight taped to the barrel cutting through the gloom. Her left arm, strapped tightly to her chest, burned with a sickening, relentless fire. Every step was a battle against shock and blood loss, but the sound of her daughter's shivering breaths behind her kept her moving. Finally, the concrete tunnel gave way to a rusted iron grate overlooking the Puget Sound. Dawn was breaking, casting a bruised, purple light over the choppy gray water. They pushed through the grate and collapsed onto the muddy embankment. They were soaked in sewage, freezing, and exhausted beyond human limits. But they were alive. "We can't keep doing this," Janet rasped, coughing up muddy water. She leaned against a rotting wooden piling, her eyes tracking the distant city skyline. "Silas won't stop. He has infinite resources. And I have 1 good arm and 5 bullets left." Maya sat in the mud, holding a trembling Nora. The billionaire heiress looked down at her ruined clothes, her bruised hands, and then at the little girl who had barely survived the night. A cold, hard realization settled over Maya's features. "Then we stop running," Maya said, her voice dropping an octave, stripping away the last remnants of her pampered childhood. "We go after Richard and Victoria. We cut off the head of the snake." Janet looked at the 19-year-old, a grim smile touching her pale lips. "That's a suicide mission, kid. I can't take a 7-year-old into a war zone." "You aren't." A deep, gravelly voice echoed from the dense tree line above the embankment. Maya gasped, shielding Nora, but Janet didn't raise her weapon. She just let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. A massive figure stepped out of the morning mist. He was a giant of a man, with a thick, graying beard, wearing a heavy flannel jacket and holding a custom-built hunting rifle casually over his shoulder. His name was Hutch. He had been Janet's heavy weapons specialist in Kandahar. Now, he lived entirely off the grid in the Cascade Mountains, trusting bears more than he trusted the government. "You look like hell, Walker," Hutch grunted, sliding down the muddy bank. His eyes softened instantly when he saw the little girl. "Hey there, tadpole, remember Uncle Hutch?" Nora, despite her exhaustion, managed a tiny, weak smile. "You smell like pine cones." Hutch chuckled, a warm, rumbling sound. He looked at Janet's heavily bandaged arm and the grim set of her jaw. He didn't ask what happened. Veterans never needed to. Janet reached into the inner pocket of her ruined tactical vest with her good hand. She pulled out a small, waterproof plastic pouch and shoved it into Hutch's massive chest. "Inside is a flash drive," Janet said, her voice cracking for the first time. "It has the routing numbers for a $2 million offshore account. And a letter of guardianship. Notarized before I took this job." Hutch looked at the pouch, his jaw tightening. "Janet, if I don't call you by midnight on Sunday." Janet interrupted, stepping closer, her eyes blazing with the fierce, terrifying love of a mother making the ultimate sacrifice. "You take her to Canada. You change her name. You use that money to give her a life where she never has to know the smell of gunpowder. Do you understand me, Hutch?" Hutch nodded slowly, placing a massive hand on Janet's uninjured shoulder. "I'll protect her like she's my own. Wraith, you have my word." Janet turned to Nora. The little girl was crying silently. Knowing what this meant, Janet dropped to her knees in the mud, wrapping her one good arm around her daughter, burying her face in Nora's wet, tangled hair. "Be brave, my little bird," Janet whispered, kissing her forehead. "Mommy has to go to work now. But I promise you, I am coming back." She stood up, tearing herself away from the only light in her dark world. She watched as Hutch gently lifted Nora into his massive arms and carried her up the bank, disappearing into the mist. Janet stood there for a long moment, the cold morning wind biting at her skin. When she finally turned back to Maya, the exhausted, broken mother was gone. The huntress had arrived. "Let's go hunt some billionaires," Janet said coldly. They didn't go to a safe house. They went to a cheap, roadside motel on the outskirts of Tacoma, paying in cash stolen from the dead mercenaries. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap bleach, but it had a high-speed internet connection and a deadbolt. Janet sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, using a pair of needle-nose pliers from a stolen toolkit to meticulously clean and reassemble her Glock with one hand. Across the room, sitting at a wobbly veneer desk, Maya Sterling was typing furiously on a heavy, military-grade laptop Hutch had left with them. "Richard and Victoria think I'm just a dumb art student," Maya muttered, her eyes reflecting the glaring code on the screen. "They forgot that when you grow up isolated in a 60-story glass tower, you spend a lot of time on computers." "Talk to me, kid, what are we looking at?" Janet asked, racking the slide of her pistol with a sharp clack. "My father's company, Sterling Global, has a ghost server," Maya explained, her fingers flying over the keys. "It's a decentralized ledger they use to hide corporate espionage funds and political bribes. Richard uses it to pay off the EPA. Victoria uses it to fund smear campaigns. I found the back door when I was 16. Janet paused, looking at the girl with genuine respect. "Can you trace the payments to Silas and the cartel?" "I already did." Maya hit the enter key with a triumphant, vengeful smack. "Look at this." Janet walked over, Leaning over Maya's shoulder, the screen displayed a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and wire transfers. 3 days ago, $2 million was wired to a front company owned by the Jimenez cartel in Mexico. Maya pointed at the screen. Yesterday, another $5 million was moved into an untraceable crypto wallet. But they made a mistake. The crypto wallet is tied to a private server hosted in a warehouse down by the Seattle docks. That's Silas's operational hub. If we have the data, we can just send it to the FBI. Janet said, testing the girl's resolve. We can walk away right now. Let the feds handle it. Maya looked up at Janet. Her dark eyes completely hardened. If we go to the FBI, Richard's lawyers will tie it up in court for 10 years. He'll make bail in an hour. And while he's out on bail, he will never stop hunting you, me, and Nora. The law can't protect us from my family's money. Janet smiled, a slow, predatory expression. So, what's the play, boss? We don't just expose them, Maya said coldly. We destroy them. But to do that, we need to know where Richard and Victoria are keeping my father. They moved him out of the hospital to a private location. If I can get to Victor before he dies, I can legally execute the new will in front of witnesses, rendering their entire coup worthless. And how do we find out where they're hiding Victor? Maya pulled up a photograph on the screen. It showed a sleek, sharply dressed man with slicked back hair and a cruel smile. This is Marcus Vance, Maya said. He's Richard's right-hand man, the fixer. He organizes the bribes, the blackmail, and he's the one who coordinated with your old boss to set us up. He knows where my father is. Where is he? Janet asked, slipping a spare magazine into her pocket. Tonight. He's having a private dinner at Laura, a Michelin star restaurant in downtown Seattle. Maya said, he thinks he's safe. He thinks we're dead. Janet grabbed her dark green jacket, carefully threading her injured left arm through the sleeve. She checked the chamber of her Glock one last time, the metallic click echoing loudly in the cheap motel room. Get your coat, Maya, Janet said, her eyes dead and cold. We're going to crash a dinner party. Marcus Vance, the sharp-suited architect of the Sterling family coup, stepped out of the warm, amber glow of Laura. He adjusted the collar of his $3,000 cashmere overcoat against the biting Seattle wind. He had just finished a plate of white truffles and a bottle of Barolo. Life, he mused, was exceptionally good when you were on the winning side of a billionaire's assassination plot. He walked down the private, brick-paved alley toward his waiting black town car. The engine was idling smoothly. Marcus opened the rear door and slid into the plush leather seat, pulling out his phone to text Richard Sterling. Home, David. He ordered the driver without looking up. The car shifted into drive and began to roll forward, slipping quietly out of the alley and into the dark, rain-slicked streets. David's taking the night off. Marcus, a voice whispered from the darkness of the seat right next to him. Marcus froze. The blood drained from his face instantly. Before he could even turn his head, the cold, unforgiving steel of a Glock 19 pressed hard against the base of his skull, right behind his right ear. Do not move, do not speak, Janet Walker said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of the adrenaline that usually accompanied violence. It was the voice of a professional who had done this 100 times before. Marcus's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The driver wasn't David. It was a young woman in a dark hoodie, her face pale but intensely focused on the road. Maya. You're "You're dead," Marcus stammered, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Silas said the bunker was incinerated. "Silas talks too much," Janet replied, pressing the barrel of the gun just a fraction harder against his skin. She shifted her weight, ignoring the throbbing pain in her bandaged left arm. "Here is how this works. Marcus, I am an Army Ranger medic. That means I know exactly how to keep a man alive while introducing his nervous system to levels of pain he didn't know existed. I can sever your ulnar nerve right now. And you will never hold a pen or a glass of scotch again. Or, you can answer my questions." Marcus swallowed hard. He was a corporate shark. A man used to destroying lives with contracts and NDAs. Not with bullets and knives. The sheer, predatory aura radiating from the woman next to him was suffocating. "What do you want?" he choked out. "Where is Victor Sterling?" Maya demanded from the driver's seat, her eyes locking with his in the rearview mirror. The soft, naive art student he remembered was entirely gone, replaced by a hardened survivor. Marcus hesitated. "If I tell you, Richard will kill me." Janet didn't argue. She simply lowered the gun, drew her combat knife with her right hand, and drove the point a quarter inch into the fleshy part of Marcus's thigh. Marcus let out a muffled, agonizing shriek, his hands flying to his leg. "Richard is tomorrow's problem, Marcus," Janet whispered, twisting the blade a millimeter. "I am today's problem. Where is the old man?" "Mercer Island," Marcus gasped, tears of pain streaming down his face. "The Sterling estate on Mercer Island. Richard and Victoria moved him there yesterday. They converted the East Wing into a private ICU." "Why move him from the hospital?" Maya asked, taking a sharp turn toward the highway. "Control," Marcus whimpered, clutching his bleeding leg. "Tonight is the Sterling Foundation's annual charity gala. The entire estate is locked down. 500 guests. Private security. No press. At exactly midnight, when the gala is at its peak, Richard is having the private doctors pull the plug. They are going to let Victor die. Sign the death certificate in-house. And execute the old will before anyone even knows Maya is missing." Janet looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was 9:15 p.m. They had less than 3 hours. "Silas is there," Marcus added, a pathetic edge of desperation in his voice. "He has 24 of his own men patrolling the grounds disguised as event security. You can't get in. It's a fortress." Janet slowly pulled the knife out of Marcus's leg and wiped the blade clean on his expensive cashmere coat. She holstered her weapons and leaned back into the shadows of the seat. "Pull over, Maya," Janet ordered. Maya slammed on the brakes, pulling the town car violently to the curb under a flickering street lamp. Janet grabbed Marcus by the collar of his shirt and shoved him hard out the door, sending him tumbling onto the wet concrete. "Run, Marcus," Janet warned, her eyes glowing like a predator in the dark. "Run very far away, because if I see your face again, I won't aim for the leg." Maya floored the accelerator, leaving the weeping fixer in the gutter. "Mercer Island," Maya said, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "He's right, Janet. The estate is on an island. There's only one bridge in. And Silas will have it locked down. How do we get inside a Billionaire's gala?" Janet reached into the glove compartment and pulled out Marcus's VIP parking pass and a stack of crisp $100 bills. She looked at Maya, a dangerous, reckless spark igniting in her gray eyes. "We don't go as guests, kid," Janet said, checking the magazine of her Glock. "We go as the help. Let's find a catering van. The Sterling estate on Mercer Island was a monument to excessive wealth. It was a sprawling, modern castle of glass, steel, and imported stone, set on 50 acres of manicured, waterfront property. Tonight, it was illuminated by hundreds of floodlights, transforming the rain-swept grounds into a glittering jewel. Inside the grand ballroom, a string quartet played Vivaldi over the low, sophisticated murmur of Seattle's elite. Women in diamond necklaces and men in bespoke tuxedos sipped vintage champagne, entirely unaware that the charity event they were attending was a smokescreen for a hostile corporate takeover and a patricide. In the chaotic, steaming depths of the estate's massive industrial kitchen, nobody noticed the new prep cook. Janet Walker stood at a stainless steel counter, her hair pulled back tightly under a black catering cap. Wearing a crisp, white chef's coat, the coat was a size too large, specifically chosen to hide the bulky bandages and the tight sling immobilizing her left arm against her ribs. Underneath the apron, tucked snugly into the small of her back, was her Glock 19. She sliced a tray of crostini with her right hand, her eyes constantly scanning the room. She was tracking the exits, the blind spots, and the movement of the security personnel. Silas's men were easy to spot. They wore the standard black suits with earpieces. But they didn't stand like private security. They stood like soldiers occupying a hostile city. "Hey, new girl," the frantic head chef yelled, pointing a pair of tongs at Janet. "Grab that tray of caviar and get out to the main floor. Table 4 needs a refill. And the VIPs are getting restless." Janet nodded silently. She balanced the heavy silver tray perfectly on her right palm, pushed through the swinging double doors, and stepped into the lion's den. The sheer opulence of the ballroom was suffocating. Janet wove through the crowd of billionaires and politicians with the invisible grace of a ghost. She kept her head down, offering polite smiles to people who looked right through her, treating her as nothing more than a piece of moving furniture. She moved toward the grand staircase that led to the restricted east wing. Two of Silas's heavily armed mercenaries stood at the bottom of the velvet rope, turning away any guests who wandered too close. Suddenly, Janet's earpiece, a micro receiver she had stolen from a downed guard earlier, crackled to life. It was Maya. "I'm in the server room on the second floor." Maya's voice whispered in her ear. "I used the ventilation shaft from the laundry room. I'm patching into the security feeds now." "Talk to me, Overwatch," Janet muttered softly, pretending to adjust her earpiece while offering a napkin to a passing guest. "Where is Silas?" "Camera 4. He's on the balcony overlooking the ballroom." "Janet, he's looking right at the crowd. He knows something is wrong." Janet slowly lifted her gaze. Up on the second-story glass balcony, standing half in the shadows, was the imposing, scarred figure of Silas. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't talking. He was scanning the sea of faces below with the cold, dead eyes of a sniper looking for a target. Janet turned her face away just as his gaze swept over her section of the room. The ghost from Kabul was here. "I have visual on the east wing," Maya reported, her fingers typing frantically on her laptop in the dark server room. "My father's room is at the end of the hall. Room 204, but there's a biometric lock on the door. And Richard is the only one who can open it. He's standing in the hallway right now, talking to Victoria." "Clock?" Janet asked softly. 11:45 p.m. "Janet, we have 15 minutes before they pull the plug on my father. If he dies, The trust transfers instantly. We lose everything. And they will hunt Nora down. Janet set the tray of caviar down on a passing waiter's cart. She felt the dull, throbbing pain in her left arm. A reminder of her mortality. She thought of Nora, sleeping miles away in the cold mountain air, trusting her mother to come home. Not tonight, Janet whispered to herself. She slipped her right hand beneath the pristine white chef's coat, her fingers wrapping around the familiar, cold grip of her pistol. She walked purposefully toward the grand staircase, her eyes locked on the two mercenaries guarding the path to the east wing. There was no more running. There was no more hiding in the shadows. "Janet, what are you doing?" Maya asked, panic rising in her voice. "There are too many of them." "I'm clearing a path, kid," Janet said, her voice dropping to a deadly, icy calm. "When I make my move, you cut the lights to the ballroom. All of them." Janet took a deep breath, letting the smell of expensive perfume and blooming adrenaline fill her lungs. She stepped directly in front of the two heavily armed guards. "Excuse me," Janet said, looking up at them with a cold, terrifying smile, "but the kitchen is closed." "Maya, now," Janet whispered into her stolen earpiece. On the second floor, hidden in the server room, Maya's fingers slammed onto the enter key. Every single light in the Sterling estate died instantly. The grand ballroom, bathed in golden opulence a second ago, was plunged into absolute, terrifying darkness. The string quartet screeched to a halt. A collective gasp rose from 500 of Seattle's wealthiest elite, followed immediately by the chaotic, deafening roar of panic. Women screamed, glass shattered as trays were dropped, and the crowd surged blindly toward the exits like a terrified herd of cattle. In the pitch black, Janet didn't panic. The darkness was her old friend. She dropped the serving tray. Her right hand whipped the Glock from the small of her back. The two mercenaries guarding the stairs fumbled for their tactical flashlights, temporarily blinded by the sudden transition. Peefed, peefed. Two suppressed shots cut through the cacophony of the screaming crowd. Both guards dropped instantly, their armor useless against precision headshots. Janet stepped over their bodies and vaulted up the grand staircase, her movements fluid and deadly despite the agonizing fire radiating from her strapped left arm. She reached the top of the landing, slipping into the east wing corridor. Emergency red backup lights flickered on, bathing the hallway in a bloody, pulsing glow. At the far end of the hall stood room 204. But blocking the path was a shadow that seemed to swallow the red light. Silas. He didn't have a gun drawn. He held a curved, matte black karambit combat knife, twirling it slowly in his massive hand. He smiled, the jagged scar on his face twisting in the crimson light. "You always were a theatrical one, Wraith," Silas rumbled, his voice echoing off the expensive artwork lining the walls. "But you're bleeding out. You have one arm. You can't beat me." "I don't have to beat you, Silas," Janet said, her voice dropping to a guttural, terrifying growl. "I just have to kill you." Silas lunged. He moved with terrifying speed for a man of his size. Janet raised her Glock, but Silas swiped his heavy forearm, knocking the barrel aside just as the gun discharged, the bullet shattering a Renaissance painting. Before she could correct her aim, Silas closed the distance, his knee driving brutally into her stomach. Janet gasped, the air leaving her lungs in a rush. Silas grabbed her injured left arm, the one strapped to her chest, and squeezed the fresh bullet wound with all his terrifying strength. A scream of pure, blinding agony tore from Janet's throat. Her vision went white. The Glock clattered to the floor. "Where is the little girl?" Silas hissed, pushing her slammed against the mahogany wall, the blade of his knife resting against her throat. "Tell me, and I'll make this quick." The pain was paralyzing. Her body was shutting down. But then, through the haze of agony, Janet heard it, the phantom sound of Nora's voice. "Mommy, are you a superhero?" The mother's instinct, primal, ferocious, and utterly unstoppable, ignited within her chest, burning away the pain. Janet stopped fighting his grip. Instead, she leaned into the knife, letting it slice a shallow cut across her collarbone, using the momentum to close the final inch between them. With her free right hand, she drew the hidden ceramic blade she had taped inside her chef's sleeve. She didn't aim for his armored chest. She drove the blade upward, with all the brutal, terrifying force of a mother protecting her child, burying it deep into the soft, unprotected tissue under Silas's jaw, straight up into his brainstem. Silas's icy eyes went wide with shock. His grip on her broken arm loosened. He let out a wet, gurgling breath, the karambit slipping from his fingers. Janet pulled the blade out, panting heavily, her face bathed in sweat and blood. Silas collapsed to the plush carpet like a felled oak tree, dead before he stopped twitching. "She's out of your reach," Janet whispered to the corpse. She picked up her Glock, stepping over the ghost of Kabul, and limped toward room 204. Inside room 204, the air was sterile and thick with the hum of medical equipment. Victor Sterling, the ruthless titan of industry, lay in a massive hospital bed, looking frail and hollowed out by cancer. His heart monitor beeped at a painfully slow, erratic rhythm. Standing over him were Richard and Victoria. A private, highly paid doctor stood nearby, his hand resting on the ventilator's power switch. "The power outage is just a blown transformer," Richard said nervously, glancing at the heavy oak doors. "Do it now, doctor. Call the time of death." Before the doctor could move, the heavy oak doors exploded inward. The heavy biometric lock sparked and smoked, blown apart by a breaching charge. Janet Walker stepped through the smoke, a terrifying vision of vengeance. Her white chef's coat was stained red, her face bruised and bleeding, but her Glock was raised and aimed squarely at the center of Richard's forehead. "Step away from the machine," Janet commanded, her voice cutting through the room like a physical blow. Richard froze, the color draining from his face. "Walker? How?" "Silas. Silas is bleeding out on your expensive carpet." Janet spat. "Move, now." Victoria, ever the venomous snake, raised her chin. "You're a bodyguard, Walker. We can pay you triple whatever my naive little sister offered you. 10 million, right now. Just put the gun down." "You don't have $10 million anymore." "Victoria," a new voice echoed from the doorway. Maya stepped into the room. She wasn't the terrified, crying girl in the oversized sweater anymore. She wore a dark, sleek tactical jacket, holding her military laptop in one hand. She looked past her stunned siblings and walked straight to her father's bedside. Victor Sterling's eyes fluttered open. He looked at his youngest daughter, a faint, fragile smile touching his lips. "Maya," the old man wheezed. "I'm here, Dad," Maya whispered, taking his frail hand. She turned back to Richard and Victoria, her eyes cold and absolute. 3 minutes ago, when I cut the power, I also initiated a mass data dump from the ghost servers. The SEC, The FBI and every major news outlet in the country just received the complete, decrypted ledger of your bribes, your cartel payments, and the assassination contracts you put on me." Richard stumbled back, hitting the wall. No, you couldn't have." "I did," Maya said simply. The distant, wailing sound of police sirens began to echo over the waters of Puget Sound, growing louder by the second. "The police aren't coming to secure the gala, Richard. They're coming for you. You destroyed the company," Victoria shrieked, lunging forward. Bang! Janet fired a warning shot that shattered a crystal vase an inch from Victoria's ear. The billionaire heiress dropped to the floor, screaming in terror. "She saved the company," Janet corrected, keeping the gun steady. "Now sit down and wait for your handcuffs." Maya looked down at her father. Victor's breathing was incredibly shallow now. The stress of the night had pushed his failing body to its absolute limit. But he was looking at Maya with something he had never shown her before: pride. "You survived the wolves," Victor whispered, his grip tightening weakly on her hand. "The empire is yours." With a long, shuddering sigh, the heart monitor flatlined. A solid, piercing tone filled the room. Victor Sterling was gone. Maya closed her eyes, letting a single tear fall. The war was over, and she had won. The aftermath was a blur of flashing red and blue lights, shouting federal agents, and a media frenzy. The Sterling estate was swarmed by the FBI. Richard and Victoria were dragged out of the mansion in handcuffs, their faces plastered across every news network in the world. The corporate coup had failed spectacularly. Maya Sterling, at 19 years old, was the sole heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire. Janet sat on the bumper of an ambulance outside the estate, watching the chaos unfold. A paramedic had finally properly cleaned and stitched her arm, wrapping it in a clean, tight cast. The heavy painkillers were finally kicking in, dulling the physical agony, but the emotional exhaustion weighed on her like a mountain. She felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. Maya stood there, wrapped in a blanket, looking at the hardened veteran. The two women didn't say anything for a long moment. Words felt entirely inadequate to describe the blood and fire they had walked through together. "The lawyers are already setting everything up," Maya said quietly, her voice hoarse. "They told me it will take a few weeks to fully untangle Richard's mess. But the assets are locked. I have the controlling shares." Janet nodded slowly, looking out over the dark water of the Sound. "You're gonna be a great CEO. Kid, you've got more iron in your spine than your father ever did." Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out a sleek, black envelope. She handed it to Janet. "It's an irrevocable blind trust," Maya said, her eyes welling with tears. $20 million, held in Nora's name, accessible by you as her guardian. It's tax-free, squeaky clean, and completely untouchable by anyone else. I also bought a house in the Pacific Northwest for you. Huge yard, good schools, safe." Janet took the envelope. Her hands, which had so ruthlessly ended lives just hours ago, were trembling violently. She looked at the piece of paper that represented absolute freedom. No more night shifts. No more eviction notices. No more blood. "Thank you, Maya," Janet whispered, a tear finally escaping her iron control and slipping down her bruised cheek. Maya stepped forward and wrapped her arms around the dangerous, broken, beautiful mother who had saved her life. Janet hugged her back with her good arm, resting her chin on the young billionaire's shoulder. "Go get her," Janet. Maya smiled through her tears. Go get your daughter. 6 months later. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink over the sprawling pine forests of Oregon. The air was crisp, clean, and smelled of cedar and rain. Janet Walker sat on the wraparound porch of a beautiful, custom-built timber house. She was wearing a comfortable, oversized sweater, her left arm fully healed, leaving only a pale, jagged scar that she no longer bothered to hide. She held a steaming mug of black coffee, her eyes entirely free of the haunted, hollow look she had carried for years. Mommy, look. Janet turned her head. Down in the massive, fenced-in yard, Nora was running through the lush green grass, chasing a golden retriever puppy. The little girl was laughing, a bright, ringing, joyous sound that echoed through the trees. She looked healthier, taller, and completely unburdened by the shadows of their past. I see it, Bug, Janet called back, a massive, genuine smile breaking across her face. Don't let him eat the tulips. A massive figure stepped out of the screen door behind her, carrying a plate of sandwiches. Hutch grunted, setting the plate on the rustic wooden table. He had taken the job as the estate's permanent groundskeeper, much to his own delight. Kid runs faster than a Humvee. Hutch chuckled, pulling up a rocking chair next to Janet. She's happy, Hutch, Janet said softly, watching her daughter tumble into the grass with the puppy. She's actually happy. You did good, Wraith, Hutch murmured respectfully. You won the war. Inside the house, the television was playing softly in the living room. A news anchor's voice drifted out through the open window. In a stunning turnaround, Sterling Global CEO Maya Sterling announced today that the company will be shifting 30% of its profits into a new philanthropic foundation aimed at supporting homeless veterans and underprivileged schools. Janet took a sip of her coffee, the warmth spreading through her chest. The empire of glass and blood had been replaced by something better. She set her mug down, walked off the porch, and ran down into the yard. Nora squealed in delight as her mother scooped her up, spinning her around in the golden sunset light. There were no more alarms, no more gunfire, no more running. For the first time in her life, Janet Walker wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a bodyguard. She wasn't a huntress. She was just a mother, entirely at peace, holding her entire world in her arms.